Welcome to the Bible Feed Podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. This is the first of a two-part episode which asks the question, can we rely on the text of the New Testament and its extraordinary claims about the life, death and resurrection of Jesus? One way to approach that question is to explore the mysterious world of textual criticism. What is it? Is it a science or is it an art? Dan talks to Phil Evans over these two episodes to make it all clear, hopefully.
My name's Dan Weatherall, and today I'm joined by Phil Evans. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for having me on.
That's all right. I'm getting you on to talk about a topic that can be very detailed and technical and dry and dusty sometimes, but together we want to make this as accessible, as fun, as lively as possible. But yeah, so what are we talking about today?
So we're talking about the text of the New Testament itself and how we can have assurance, I think anyway, that it is reliable.
So a reliable, as in the New Testament that we read in our Bibles today, whichever version we're using, is going to be an accurate reflection of what was originally written. That's what we're examining, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's not so much about the message itself and the teaching of the Bible. You know, they're topics I know you cover in other podcasts that you do. This is more about the words on the page. You know, how can we know that when we're reading them, they are the words that were originally written so many years ago?
Absolutely. Therefore, it's important, isn't it? If we want to place any value in any of the message of the Bible, then knowing that what we've got is actually what was originally there in the first place is kind of an important thing, isn't it? So yeah, I think I say this on lots of these episodes I do, that we're the ordinary people. We're not the experts, and this is one of those that's absolutely. It shows that for sure. I don't know how many textual critics there are in the world, but textual criticism is the field, isn't it, that studies this? Yeah,
you're absolutely right. It's a very specialised subject. There are not many of us can claim to be textual critics. It is a field that involves a lot of study and actually brings to bear a whole number of different disciplines on the text of Scripture. You quite rightly say that we are not the experts, but the beauty of this area, I think, like most, is that there are a lot of very good resources out there, because it's in the interests of the people who do work in this area to make it accessible to folk like you and I and your listeners. Because, if they just sort of sit in their ivory towers and churn out this stuff, it's in their interest that it doesn't just sort of sit gathering dust, but they actually make it understandable to ordinary folk like you and I.
So we're leaning heavily on the information out there.
Yeah, and I think there might be a chance just to talk about some of those resources at the end, perhaps, sure. or link to them in the description.
Yeah, that'd be good. Okay, good. Let's start by sort of framing this topic then, because sometimes this is perceived as a bit of a problem or almost a challenge to Christianity or a challenge to the Bible, isn't it? How can we be sure that the New Testament, and today we're just talking about the New Testament, how can we be sure that what we've got in our Bibles does reflect what was originally written in the Greek language many, many years ago? Can you talk us through why it is sometimes a problem?
Well, imagine today that you were to walk into a bookshop. Here in the UK, we have Waterstones, for example. If you were to walk into a Waterstones bookshop and purchase a book, you could then go to another Waterstones branch, in another city, some hundreds of miles away perhaps, and buy exactly the same book. And you could be absolutely certain, barring any sort of horrendous mistakes at the printers, that the words would be exactly the same, that both copies, if you examine them, would be identical. And we kind of take that for granted, in our modern Western world with the invention of the printing press, and we just take it for granted that we've got printed copies that are exactly the same. Now, that is the issue, because the Bible is an ancient book. The New Testament was written, some 2,000 years ago, and the copies were not printed, at least not until the 15th century when the printing press was invented. So the copies that we have are, for the most part, handwritten. And that presents an issue because you have a fairly complicated and messy history of transmission.
Yeah.
Because whenever you hand a piece of text down from generation to generation in a handwritten format, you get mistakes that creep in, whether intentional or otherwise, and we'll go on to talk about some of those. So that's the issue at the nub of the problem here, that you've got handwritten copies that have been handed down over 2 millennia.
Okay, and it's a long time, isn't it? And I suppose we don't have any of the originals.
We don't have the originals, no. I mean, the originals would have been written on papyrus, which is sort of made out of dried reeds. The trouble with that kind of material is it doesn't last very long. So the originals have almost certainly crumbled to dust now. And I guess you can take another illustration here to think about this problem. When I was a kid at school, we used to play a game. It's probably not politically correct to describe it in this way now, but it was called Chinese Whispers.
Yeah, or telephone, I think.
I think it's called telephone, perhaps, by some people. Yeah, the idea is that you have a group of friends, and you pick a person to start, and they choose just a simple message or a word or a phrase or anything that comes into their head, and they whisper it to the person next to them, and then that person whispers it to the person next to them, and so on. And then when it gets all the way around the circle, the person in the last place, says the message out loud, and typically the message has been corrupted along that path. Some people have done it deliberately just to be silly, but in other cases it's a genuine misunderstanding. They haven't heard it properly.
Yeah,
and that on some small level illustrates the problem here. That when you pass a message on in that way with kind of limited controls, it does become corrupted. It's inevitable.
It illustrates the problem really well. We've got not just a playground of that game, but we've got a 2,000-year history and different cultures and translations and copies and everything. So it can seem a bit hopeless sometimes. And there's sort of prominent people, aren't there, who've made a thing of that. Thinking Bart Ehrman, for example, name that many listeners might know, who've sort of made a big deal of this transmission history and how that there's been lots of changes and so on.
That is part of the problem, that you have some fairly big names who make some fairly big and bold statements about this, and perhaps make them knowing that they are making them to an audience who might not know the ins and outs and some of the nuances behind this stuff. You mentioned Bart Ehrman there, who interestingly is a New Testament textual critic himself, which adds an interesting angle onto this. He sort of goes to town on this a little bit in his book, Misquoting Jesus. I have the quote here. He says, and again, this is in the section where he's sort of trying to frame the problem here. So he says, not only do we not have the originals, we don't even have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. So really playing on this fact that we don't have the originals. We just have copies, and they are sort of far removed from when the original sort of autographs, as they're called, were first written.
And going back to what we sort of said at the start, this can seem a really big problem, can't it, for Christians? So, Christianity is based on the life and teaching of Jesus and the claims of what happened at his death, and then on the third day his resurrection. And so if all we've got to base all that on, the text of the New Testament, is actually how can we know that's reliable? Then that's quite a serious charge, then, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And if you're somebody who perhaps has never really given this much thought before, and you come across those kinds of challenges, you might not be sure how you can adequately address them. It can cause Christians to doubt their own faith and trust in what they're actually reading.
Okay, so let's try and sort of address this problem. We've acknowledged that it could be a challenge, it could be a problem, and we've got to just think through it and take sort of textual criticism seriously and so on. So what can we do? We've got, our Bibles printed and bound, or, electronically or whatever. What can we do to compare that with anything? How on earth can we start making the assessment as to whether or not it's reliable?
The way we do that is actually think about how the Bible has come to us today. As you said, most of us, if we are Bible readers, will have at the very least an electronic Bible these days in the palm of our hand, or a nice sort of leather-bound Bible with various helps that aid us in our reading, like bookmarks and center margins and references and maps in the back and all of that good stuff. It's easy when we've got that in front of us to forget that the Bible didn't just sort of float down from heaven in that form, or wasn't wasn't dug up, out of a shiny metal box in a perfectly preserved, nicely bound book. It has a messy history of transmission, and the way we piece that together is by looking back at the manuscripts that have come down to us to the present day. So, we've mentioned already papyrus, which the original autographs would have been written on. The likes of Paul and the gospel writers actually sat writing these down, or perhaps in some cases dictating them to a scribe who's writing them. After that, then, the message is then transmitted onwards. Put yourself in the shoes of a first century Christian, in a church somewhere in the Mediterranean, and hey, you've received a letter from the Apostle Paul. Great excitement, and you all gather together in your church to hear that letter being read. Perhaps just sort of hand it round, but more typically it would have been read to you, at a congregational gathering. And then after you've heard that, you might think, oh, it would be really useful for the church, 20 miles in the next province to hear this as well. But, and we know we've got someone in our church who's, perhaps a businessman who's going on the road selling his wares, and he's going that way next week. Why don't we make a copy of it and send that with him, and he can take it to that church, and then so on and so forth. So you can see how from that kind of nucleus that the message would spread, because people would want to get these letters out. So they made copies of them. Either on papyrus at that early stage, but then sort of converting over to manuscripts and codexes, which is the old word for a book. So the way we sort of piece together how we've got to where we've got today is by looking at those manuscripts. And when you do that, you realise what an incredible resource we have.
Sort of aware that there's lots of biblical manuscripts. How old are they as well? I mean, it's 2,000 years we're talking about, that give or take, aren't we, from when these New Testament documents were first written. So that's still a long time, and we could have really ancient manuscripts but still be really far removed as well.
Let's perhaps just back up and just think about the volume and the number of manuscripts that we have in the first instance, because I think that's probably the starting point.
Okay.
Because we might ask the same question of any of the ancient classical authors whose works we still have extant today. Well, what's the manuscript evidence for them? We've got works by Herodotus, for example, who is best known as the biographer of Alexander the Great, and we've got 106 of his works in existence today. And then we can look, for example, at Caesar, who wrote monumental works on his conquest of Gaul and the Roman civil wars and various other bits and pieces as well. And how many have we got for him? We've got 251. Okay, and then we've got Livy, the Roman historian, who wrote a monumental work on the history of Rome, and we've got 473 of his works. So these are the manuscripts we've got to work with, and that sounds quite good. 473 sounds like quite a lot.
Yeah, it does.
However, we then turn to the New Testament and we ask the same question: what manuscript evidence have we got for the writings of the New Testament? And when we add all that together, we've got almost 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts.
Oh, wow.
Now, I should say here, these are not manuscripts with the entire New Testament in each one. Some of them are only very fragmentary. We do have manuscripts with the entire Greek New Testament in them, but the vast majority of them are pieces from here and there, basically what survived and come down to us today.
That's a huge difference, though, isn't it? Jumping up from something like 400 to 6,000.
It does really dwarf, all of those other ancient authors, just in the sheer volume of evidence we've got today. It's one of the most well-known New Testament textual critics called Bruce Metzger, who writes in his book, the textual critic of today is actually embarrassed by the wealth of evidence. You've got your textual critic who's studying the works of Plato or Herodotus or whoever else that might have a few hundred. the textual critic of the New Testament as they're, surrounded by stacks of paper, 4 feet high. That's the kind of evidence they've got to work with. But of course, that brings another challenge, which is actually getting through the whole lot anyway. But we'll come on to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's an awful lot, and a lot of them, some of them do go back quite early, don't they? And this is, we're not going to get into technicalities of how they date them based on handwriting and all sorts. But, some are pretty early. That there's P52, I think, is meant to be the very, very earliest one we've got, a small little fragment of the Gospel of John.
Yeah, that's right. I guess just to hold that thought and just back up again and again, just ask the comparison question. Well, how long is the time gap with those ancient authors between when their works were first written and the earliest surviving copies we've got? And again, you can present this in a nice graph. Take Caesar again. We ask, okay, what's the time gap between when he was writing and our oldest surviving copy? And the time gap there is 850 years.
Okay,
a huge gap of some 8 or 9 centuries between when Caesar originally penned those words and our earliest surviving copy of them. It gets a little bit better, so if we take, for example, let's take a name again, Livy, we mentioned him earlier. The time gap there comes down to 300 years, and then, you come down to, for example, Plato, the Greek philosopher there. You've got 200 years between when he was writing and our earliest copy. But again, you then compare that to the New Testament. As you said, we've got some manuscripts like P52, for example. What you find when you look at manuscripts is they're not very imaginatively named. They're generally just given a number. But you can understand why, because you've got almost 6,000 of them. You can't think of a name for all of them, right? But yeah, P52 is universally acknowledged as the earliest surviving scrap of New Testament that we have today. So that is currently housed in the John Rylands Library here in Manchester, and you can go and see that if you wish. If you ask them nicely to get it out of its nice perspex box for you. But yeah, we've got manuscripts like that, and P52, for example, is as you said a scrap of the Gospel of John. It's only about 2 or 3 verses, so it's by no means a big chunk of it. But considering that the Gospel of John is thought to have been written around 90 to 100 AD, and P52 is dated to about 125 to 175 AD, you've got there a manuscript that potentially is dated to within 50 to 100 years of when it was first written, of when John first wrote those words, which is absolutely astonishing when you think of it.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, that's just one little example, isn't it? And there's others, from that point on, other little scraps, and then you get bigger manuscripts as well, and then you get things like the early church fathers in their documents that they wrote. They quote the New Testament as well. So
yeah, you've not just got the manuscripts themselves. You've got quotations of the church fathers, as you said, who are quoting from them extensively. You've also got translations as well into other languages.
Of course, yeah.
So, as the writing started to circulate around the Mediterranean, then churches in different places would have needed to read them in a language other than Greek. So you've got translations into languages like Gothic, Armenian. And again, textual critics, people who look into this kind of stuff and examine the manuscripts can use those lines of evidence as well to compare against. So there really is a huge amount to go at here.
Okay, so that's a good start, really. I think to starting to think actually there is a lot of basis here to the New Testament. But if you go along, anyone can hop along to like the Wikipedia page for textual variants in the New Testament. It starts like listing out estimates. So for example, Bartman, we've talked about him. At one point estimated there's between 200,000 to 400,000 variants in the manuscript. So we're talking about the changes now.
Yeah.
But other people have estimated there's changes in between all these manuscripts as high as like 750,000. So having all these manuscripts, that's really great. But if we've got all these thousands of changes, how can we rely on them? I
suppose to some extent this is a bit of a double-edged sword. Yes, we have all of this fantastic textual evidence, but you can take any 2 manuscripts from that repository of nearly 6,000 and compare them. and no two will match exactly word for word. And so, you've introduced the term variant there, which I guess is a technical term in this field. So a variant simply means any place in the manuscript evidence where there is a variation. It could be simply word order. It could be, a variation just in spelling. It could be verses that are omitted or included in one manuscript, which may not be in another. And you're absolutely right. With such a wide basis from which to start, you would expect that. So to a certain extent, when we hear those giant figures being tossed around, and someone says, "Well, you've got 400,000 variants in the Greek New Testament. How do you deal with that?" Yeah, again, that is a challenge. And it's a big, scary number, and one which, to the uninitiated or a person who's not perhaps as familiar with this, that might cause them some worry. But again, there are ways which this problem can be approached. I guess the first thing to state is that a huge amount of that variation is fairly insignificant.
Okay.
So by that we mean variants which don't really have any impact on the message itself.
So things like spelling and...
Yeah, so I think about when I'm writing documents on my MacBook here, I might have Microsoft Word open, and if I write the word colour and spell it in a certain way, it will underline it with a wavy red line because it wants me to use the American spelling and leave a U out.
Americans.
Or words like labour, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It tries to do the same with that one. If I was to leave it in and send that to an American audience, they would still be able to understand it. It doesn't change the message, but it is a variant. So a great many of the variants that we find within the Greek New Testament and that textual tradition are of that variety. So really quite inconsequential. Others might be variation in word order, where again you've got roughly the same words in there, they're just in a slightly different order. But again, it's not affecting the overall sense of the message itself.
So there's loads that are sort of inconsequential. I mean, there's still going to be quite a few or lots of variants that alter the meaning. Is it fair to say that because there's so many changes, it is actually possible to trace where changes have come about? Is it the fact that there are these many changes that really helps us, or helps the textual critics to actually work out and trace and show where the changes have come about, and therefore be a bit more certain about what was original?
I think this is a reasonable place where we can actually just take a step back and just talk about what we mean by textual criticism.
Okay, yeah.
And what a textual critic is, because that's a term that we've used a couple of times so far in this conversation. So I guess just to explain first of all that when we hear the word criticism, we might think that's a negative thing. We might think that these are people engaged in somehow criticising the New Testament and the Word of God. That's not what it means in this context. It simply means, that these are people who exercise a judgment and make a critical decision about a text. And it's worth just pointing out as well that this doesn't just apply to the Bible text. Textual criticism is something that happens with other ancient or older texts as well. So, for example, if you're studying the works of Shakespeare, you might come across a critical edition of the works of Shakespeare. It even happens in music as well. You can have critical editions, for example, Beethoven symphonies. So all it means is that you've got somebody who has taken the extant evidence that we have for that work and applied some thought to it and applied some rules and actually said, okay, we've got all of this evidence. It differs in places, but what can we be pretty sure about best reflects the original writing that was committed to paper or parchment or manuscript or whatever it might be. So that's what New Testament textual critics do. and Old Testament ones as well. In fact, many of these principles are the same there.
Yeah.
Just with the Old Testament, they've got a lot less to go on. So what textual critics do is they gather all of that evidence together, and they apply some rules to it, and they try to take a balanced view of which reading of any particular manuscript best represents what came before. The way they don't do that is by simply spreading all the manuscripts out on the table and saying, well, I have a bit of that one and a bit of that one, and I like the way this scribe wrote it here. We'll take that bit, to kind of match their own doctrinal inclinations. That's certainly not what they do. They apply some established and standardized rules to all of this stuff, and it's interesting. It's sort of part science and part art.
Yeah, by doing that and looking at the changes, where they've come about, where the manuscript was found, what sort of age of writing it was, and you can start to see the themes and trace the patterns and work out how variants have arisen. And
just again, to take an example again, imagine that in your family you have a recipe for cookies, and you know that this recipe has been handed down over 100 years. So it was handed down by your grandma, and then she got it from her great grandma, and she got it from her great great grandma, and so on.
Yeah.
So you've got this very old recipe, and in fact, your cousins, their recipe differs slightly from yours, even though it's been handed down.
Oh, I see.
From the same original source. So you in your family, your recipe might say that the cookies contain chocolate chips, but cousin John's recipe, and he's based in a different country perhaps, his might say, well, no, it actually contains raisins. And one recipe says brown sugar, and another says demerara sugar, and you can easily see how some of those mistakes may have been passed on. It may have been someone who's copying the recipe out, and it originally said D. It just had the letter D, sugar, and someone may have mistaken that for a B, which then sort of turned it into brown sugar. All of these illustrations break down eventually, but that sort of illustrates how these difficulties and these variations can happen. So what you might do is you might say, okay, let's gather all of those recipes in and just compare them, and you can see, in actual fact, I can see that the recipes that all say brown sugar are from Australia, and the ones that all say we should use chocolate chips are all from 1990 and all centered in this particular location. So that's the kind of theory that textual critics will apply. There's a lot more to it, of course, but those kinds of questions they will ask. Where is the manuscript from? How old is it? Is it from a particular location? Is it from a particular group of scribes, or a particular sect of Christianity that we know had proclivities or inclinations toward this or that way of doing things? There's all sorts of questions and bits of information that they can bring to bear on this. But the result is that they end up with a New Testament where, and this is the important point to make, take your cookie recipe. Yes, there might be variations in the ingredients and the quantities of them and the spelling of them, but at the end, you've still got a cookie, right? You're still all making a cookie with that recipe. And I guess you could say that about the New Testament as well. Yes, there are variations between them. There are variations in translations as well, which is kind of the downward stream of this activity. But in the end, the message is the same. You're reading about the same Jesus, and it's the same gospel in there.
Yeah, because all these variations, the textual critics can trace them as much as they can, and end up with something that is as reliable as it can be. But actually, if they got some things a little bit wrong, and like you said, translations make different decisions, actually, don't they? In some cases, some verses are included, some verses aren't. But at the end of the day, those question marks, those kind of uncertain details, they're quite small compared to the actual certainty of a lot of the conclusions. Still got a cookie.
Yeah, you still got a cookie. If we think that the gospel message itself is centered in the person of Jesus Christ, who he was, where he came from, the fact that he died and was raised again, and that through that act, we can have our sins forgiven and a hope of life and be reconciled to God. That core message of the gospel does not change. no matter hopefully which translation you're using, and which text this is based on as well.
Whichever manuscript you got, there's no doubt that that's what the apostles were preaching. This has all been really good. What about diving into just a few examples of variants and variations and changes and so on?
Well, that is where we will pause this investigation of the New Testament text, its variants, and the discipline of textual criticism, which aims to get us as close to the original words that were written. In the next episode, as Dan said, he and Phil will continue by delving into specific examples of variants and thinking about how much or how little they should affect our reliance on the New Testament as a witness to Jesus, the Son of God. You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think or other subjects you'd like us to discuss. So get in touch with us at biblefeed.org or on our Facebook page or at Bible Feed Online on Twitter, and be part of the journey.